I am super happy to introduce amazing Nancy Crandall. Nancy is a Denver-based web developer at CPS with over 13 years of coding experience, with a passion for accessibility, front-end stacks, and a strong sense of curiosity to grow skills and lead a successful development project. During her free time, away from coding, is spent mostly outside of enjoying open water swims, playing hockey on an amateur women's league, and hiking all over the Rockies. So, Nancy, the floor is all yours.
What we're going to talk today about is the journey into full stack with using GraphQL and React. So some of this is going to be a very technical kind of deep dive into React and how you can use GraphQL APIs to basically pull in code, and we're going to do a pretty heavy deep dive into it. So beginning our journey into full stack React, we're going to go through and talk about first what's the difference of actually what GraphQL is, and then we're going to go through and talk about what exactly REST API, and then we're going to go a little bit of the benefits and kind of the pros and cons of GraphQL, and then we're going to go a little bit of a deep dive into a React GraphQL project setup that I did, and then we're just going to kind of just discuss, should you actually use GraphQL in your projects? All right, so let's begin our journey going into, and actually, as I should also explain that I'm more of a front-end developer. So I kind of recently, within the last, I guess, few years, I've been starting to get a little bit more into full stack. So when I started getting a bit more into full stack, I decided to kind of start taking this approach with using Node.js and kind of going a little bit more into using JavaScript as a full stack, doing the backend and the front-end coding. So what is exactly GraphQL? So GraphQL was actually created by Facebook in 2012, and it's basically a query data language that's basically used to pull in APIs, and it's basically uses a single endpoint to basically create multiple versions of the same API, and it's also used mostly in a headless setup. So kind of where you would have like a CMS, or like I think it was mentioned earlier with one of the keynote speakers, so they talked about using a CMS with WordPress and having a headless setup. You could technically use GraphQL in that kind of instance. So let's kind of talk a little bit about GraphQL and the difference between that and REST API. So GraphQL, and I think most people are familiar with REST. REST has been around forever. It is basically, they kind of have different approaches to things, especially the schema definition language, or the SDL. REST is an endpoint that's tied to an identity resource. That means a lot of endpoints with different shapes, and GraphQL, on the other hand, has custom schema that developers can describe multiple operations in the same link as long as they identify it with a different keyword. There's also like different handling of resources. REST, basically, as you can see, like if you wanted to make for example, a call to like the Women Who Code database that pull the speakers and the topics, you would probably create multiple routes and have like basically URL paths to create and pull in that information and data. In GraphQL, it kind of uses a single endpoint. So you would actually do one call to your server or to your database and pull all of that in. Both REST and GraphQL have similar approaches to moving data and start functions. However, GraphQL repeats several times and requesting details in a long run. This basically helps prevent overfetching or underfetching that often happens a lot inside of REST API. One quick note I'll also kind of talk about, if anyone's heard of GraphQL, or one of the issues, a lot of pain points people have, is the caching method. REST is actually a little bit better at handling caching and can use basically the get method, but however, GraphQL, using mostly the post method to fetch data, it's not really identified by URLs, and it can basically cause some issues. I know there's a lot of resources and ways that you can fix it with GraphQL, but again, it's kind of a little bit of a pain point. So as I mentioned, just going again with like fetching that data that I talked about, there's just kind of assume that like basically you want to pull in the information, like I mentioned, to have those speakers and get like the sessions of the topics and what those kind of different calls would look like. And you can see that REST API is making multiple kind of calls versus GraphQL. You kind of make one post query call, and then you're able to get multiple. You can make mutations, which is basically your application, like your React application, can actually make edits into your database. it's kind of a high level, really quick rundown of the differences between REST and GraphQL. So yeah, let's continue onwards into it. So because React and GraphQL are both created by Facebook, that means these two applications work incredibly well together. So let's kind of get a little bit more into how we can figure out like what's the benefits of it and why we actually maybe want to use this for your project. So the GraphQL schema, and the great thing about it for a front-end developer is I think that it has a really great usable, like understand AI, or excuse me, UI interface that you can basically go through and make your queries. And it's also, I think, a little bit of an easier language. It kind of looks like a very simple kind of like JSON array output. So it's like not something that you, as a front-end JavaScript developer, it's not going to be unfamiliar to you. That means kind of like that readable hierarchical structure. The relationships between those are going to be definitely defined by the graphical structure, and everyday object types repeat kind of components, and it helps from object type to represent the component wrapping another component. So again, the structure, I'll show you guys, it'll kind of makes a little bit of sense there. The other nice thing about it is it's very, very like, even though it's new, I came out in 2012, there's a lot of open sources and a lot of like tutorials and a lot of applications that you can use that basically help you extend it and make it easier to code in the back end. And so you're not kind of having to code everything just vanilla JavaScript from scratch. And I will also say the other nice thing about it is it kind of does not dictate a specific kind of application structure. So your architecture and patterns can be introduced on existing REST API, and you can also work with all their existing API management tools. So you're not really structured into how to like do stuff. As I kind of mentioned a little bit, there is a little bit of a learning curve, especially if you come from a REST API kind of setup and you're kind of used to doing that. I will also say too that there's can be a lot of nested complexity. The nice thing that you're doing one post call, but the issue is if you have a lot of data that you're pulling and you start nesting it, it can become really complex and cause some issues. And then the biggest thing is GraphQL shifts a lot of the work to the server side. So the server ends up needing to do a lot more parsing and kind of pairing and querying and verifying parameters. And as I mentioned also previously, we talked about the differences between REST and GraphQL. There's the caching is a huge issue where the REST API, you can access multiple URLs and have on a resource level. But with, on the other hand, GraphQL is very complex because it needs to have each query and identifying, and it operates kind of as a different kind of entity. So, yeah. So enough of going over slides and kind of doing like, reading all these bullet points. Let's actually look at some code. So we're going to go directly into a lot more of a technical kind of aspect. We're going to basically show a little bit of like React and have a little bit of GraphQL breakdown. And yeah, let's just go straight into it, get real technical real fast. So I've created basically a React on the front end and a Node on the back end project. You can scan this QR code that I have on the PowerPoint, or you can go to my personal GitHub account. I created basically a demo with the idea that kind of, as I discussed previously, of like having a CMS, or if you have another website that you want to pull specific data from. So in this use case, I basically wanted to say, I want to pull all the speakers and their topics from the Women Who Code database, and I'm going to then pull that into my remote React app. Again, I'm using all mock data. I didn't actually go in and pull data from the Women Who Code database. I'm all just using mock data for this kind of use case. So let's break down a little bit of what our project is going to look like. So as you can see here, that it's going to be basically a React application with where I'm using basically Express and GraphQL and as a Node.js server. And then the database is just going to be using mock data JSON, but in a future use case, I'd probably use MongoDB because it's works really well. And it's also within like a lot of stacks and stuff like that, that's pretty commonly used with React. I also, if you guys haven't noticed, again, as I mentioned, from a front end perspective, this can be really daunting that you're like, oh my gosh, this is like, I've got to set up a server and all these terrifying things. But the good news is it's all JavaScript. So like, yes, GraphQL is a new language, but I'll show you guys it's not too different. The nice thing is Node.js is JavaScript, and React app works beautifully with this, and you kind of have this really like everything is basically coming together that way. So looking at the Mongo, or so excuse me. So this is basically what I would get from my MongoDB is basically just a JSON array. And again, I will say that it's I have some data topics and speakers that I'm pulling from the database, and this is just basically what I would get in a JSON format. Cool. So I'm not going to go extensively into setting up the Express and GraphQL server together. That would just be kind of like a coding, I don't want to make this into a tutorial, but if you just look inside the GitHub repo, you can see in the server directory, you can basically look at the server and see how it's created. I will just make a quick note that if you start to get lost and panicked, it's set up similar to a any sort of React app, any sort of Next.js application where you're using a package.json to set up your server. You basically just do an install. I just wanted to highlight here that I'm just even on your where you're setting up, you're adding in GraphQL, that it's very similar to JavaScript. So you basically how you would import any other sort of package and dependency in a JavaScript project, you do the same thing with GraphQL. So, nothing too outlandish that we haven't seen before. And again, as I mentioned, the nice thing about GraphQL is it's very, very open source. There's so many guidelines. They have lots of tutorials. There's like 18 different ways, if not more, to how you can set up the projects. I just want to highlight here again that like if you notice the GraphQL IDs and syntax are very similar to what we see as most JavaScript object types. And it is like using JavaScript strings, integers, and numerates. So the syntax is going to be very familiar that all of us front-end developers are very like used to and know how to do. So this is again all on the Express server side. We haven't actually set up anything. This is just basically creating query types, and I'm going through and creating up the topic query type. So that's all this is here. You basically going through and just creating it and then saying what I'm parsing or adding my objects as. So yeah. So on the left side, if you can remember, that's our JSON data that I'm pulling from the database. And then what I'm doing here is making my query call, which is basically from what I did previously in my Node Express JavaScript, is basically creating a little query, which is the GraphQL, basically making a post command to grab the code and basically pull it into my GraphQL server, and then it outputs it as that nice little JSON array. So I'm also going to mention here, as you can see here, I'm running it on port localhost. So this is basically using the GraphQL Express library server with /HTTP or /GraphQL and the HTTP endpoint on port 4000. And that's all I'm doing to just kind of have this all running. All right, so pulling in more data, and then I just want to kind of like show again that like creating a new query type, it's just the same rinse and repeat. So creating another GraphQL object, you kind of end up, especially on the Node server side, just creating a lot of like similar functions and pulling in different kind of GraphQL objects and strings and like what you want to basically pull out of your database. I also want to just mention this is kind of the powerhouse of GraphQL, again, using the single endpoint in the same database and just being able to pull in the speakers like I do with the topics and just pulling in all that data. So yeah, so this is going through the same thing. Just again, creating a new query. You don't have to specify if you're doing a query. You can also just have it as these two nice little brackets and it'll pull in my data, which all I did was add in the speakers with it on top of my topics. And now I'm pulling all that data in. So I'm now getting both the topics and also the Women Who Code speakers. So just also a quick note, you don't have to call in all the data. So like, for example, I have inside of my database people's occupations. Maybe I don't want that. So it's just removing it simply from my query, and then it will pull up, just remove it from my data. Really easy. And again, this doesn't also dictate it on the React side. This is just also the GraphQL UI that lets me know if I'm pulling in my queries correctly and also what kind of my endpoint's going to basically output, so I can actually see what I'm getting. And it's really nice. And also it will, if you're missing anything, I should have actually shown this, it will show you if you have an error, or if it'll help you. Also has really nice docs, and like, again, walks you through this. So let's get into React, the fun stuff. So going back to a little bit more of what we know. Again, I'm a vanilla JavaScript developer by trade. So I basically used just a vanilla JavaScript fetch API to basically pull in my data like you would with any sort of API. What this basically does is it's just going to pull from our local host running the GraphQL Express server in the background. I am now pulling in my query API data, and then basically going through, and then you can see I'm the same query that I dropped inside of the UI of the GraphQL server. I'm now pulling that into my React project. And how I created this also on a side note, this React project is just literally a React Start app. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't add any other fancy stuff. I'm just literally dropping this straight into the app.js. Cool. So I also want to mention, as I said before, since I'm using React, I'm going to go ahead and use effect and the use state, because those are really awesome tools that it's used within React to basically make a network request. Since I'm also using the vanilla JavaScript of the fetch API, but I just basically want to call out that the use effect in this instance is basically kind of making an async call and a catch statement to pull in the data. And then the use state is basically setting those speakers and set speakers, that it's actually making it kind of, it's a simply like, I would compare it to like a JavaScript await. That's like after the data is set, it adds in those values and then passes it into the use state array, if that makes sense. So you'll see later on, basically, again, just highlighting using those to make those network requests that's being set and added into that speakers that I'm going to pull down later into my React render. So lower on the page, I would have my React render here. And I just want to call out that the validate, basically the data is being pulled in. I'm just using JSON stringify just to output it onto the page, using React doing the best thing that it can do. You can notice there that I'm using also that speakers that I talked about that's being defined in the use state is now being pulled into here, and it's just dumping all my data in. Cool. And then again, using those speakers to just kind of clean it up, doing what one of the map array or map filters, that one of the things that JavaScript or React, loves doing. So just kind of going through and then looping that, and then later on creating also a secondary using within that map to make a second map to pull in also the topics. Yeah, so it's just cleaning it up with some nice map, and then I'm going through and adding some nice CSS and making it real pretty. All right, so should you use GraphQL? Should you go on this journey and actually end up using it for your project? I think it comes down to like any sort of coding situation of whether or not it actually fits your project requirements, if you actually need to go through and implement, or if you have or what's your use case for it, if you have any stack limitations, there's all those kind of things of whether or not. For myself as a front end going into FullStack, I think it is a excellent tool that helps you with all the support. And it's also was intended to be built. I mean, it was made by the Facebook team, so it was intended to be built with React. So it is really partnered and paired a lot with it. And so it's got the mindset for front end developers. And kind of with that being said, there's so many different ways that you can integrate it. You don't have to just use vanilla JavaScript fetch API. There's multiple clients and ways to pull in GraphQL. There's a ton of popular libraries that are made to make it easy to interact with it, including Adobe Experience Manager actually has a built-in GraphQL thing. So if you want to have that GraphQL editor and API, and they actually have a ton of tutorials of how to set it up, as well as WordPress does. So there's many ways that you can get around it and add it back in, then to have basically make your project easier. So looking over it, GraphQL, I think, is basically was intended to be used for front-end developers with them in mind, especially since it was there to help simplify the ways to request answers with sometimes really complex and very heavy data structures. And it makes it easy to do a bit more without having to rewrite all your code. And I know a lot of, myself included, I'm always very hesitant to jump into a lot of full stack projects or even do everything from the back end to the front end, because sometimes it's really daunting to learn a new language or to jump in and try to be like learn a whole new setup and everything. And server setup can sometimes be terrifying. But the nice thing is that there is a setup you can use that's, you know, thankfully with Node.js and Express or Fastify, if you want to try something even that's a similar adjacent to Express, you can have a quite easy way to do a server setup and then pull in cool like things to like GraphQL and be able to talk to databases and pull in and work with your whole projects. Yeah, so I think overall GraphQL kind of helps make this much more of a database clear way of working with it and make it becoming a full stack developer a much more obtainable goal. So here's some resources that I have. I know my slides will be made available after this, and you can definitely go through and kind of do a little bit more extra reading if you'd like. But yeah, ready to thank you guys and ready to open it up to some questions.
We have a lot of questions here.
Sure.
T is asking, is it possible to mix GraphQL and Rest?
Yes, you absolutely can. Yeah, there's in a lot of you can basically, it's the nice thing about GraphQL is you can put it on any type of API as well. But yeah, you can totally mix REST API as well as GraphQL together. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And let's see for the rest of the questions. Well, best courses that you might recommend. I know that you shared some resources. Any course in specific that you want to say like, oh, this is a 101 for?
Oh, like a tutorial or anything like that?
I believe so.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I like on YouTube some free courses that I think are all great for any sort of front developer. His name is Jack Harrington or Harrington. I have to look it up again, but he's an excellent full stack developer, and he goes into basically gives pros and cons. His videos are very lightweight in 25 minutes or so. Really great full like tutorials that you build a whole application. There's someone called the Net Ninja, and he does more full stack front end focus, so React and stuff like that. But he does even Python and stuff like that too, and those are all free. Yeah,
great. And Alicia is asking, my question is, what project would you recommend to start learning GraphQL?
I think it depends on what you want to build, to be honest with you, because like I mean. I mentioned before is like if you're working with a CMS and you want to have a headless setup, or like right now I'm building out a fun little project for myself as a password chain like protecting thing, because I don't want to use an online application. I just want to run something locally. So I think it depends on what your project and your requirements are. But yeah, I think find a problem and then build something cool.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Let me see, where did I? Helen is asking, I'm just learning full stack development, so GraphQL React is a good for as a starting point, or do you feel like there is any background required in order to jump into React and GraphQL?
No, I don't think so. I think that's also a little bit of an issue of that you basically hesitant to jump into something because you need to have like a bunch of experience. I think just jumping into it, and GraphQL will tell you when it's wrong. Like I mentioned that nice UI, like it'll have like little squiggly errors if you like mistype something or if it doesn't match a query endpoint. It'll absolutely tell you this not found error, and the errors are a little vague, but at least you'll have like an indication of what went wrong. But yeah, I think you don't have to have extensive experience. I think the nice thing about it is that if you want to, again, it depends on what setup you're doing. As I mentioned, like if you are using like an enterprise level like AEM, that's actually got GraphQL endpoints. You don't need to set up a server. You actually also don't need to work with a database either. You can just pull in data because AEM doesn't work with a database, but you can basically use GraphQL that way too. But yeah, it's just nice to also be able to set up this Node.js server if you want to do that. So yeah.
That's amazing. So Nancy, you mentioned that GraphQL is an alternative to REST. Do you feel like it will sometime replace it?
I don't think so because Rust has been around for so long. I think it's like a lot of languages where it's just basically an alternative way to do something. Again, and I think it's a little bit more readable and understandable. I know some companies have gone out there and basically replaced REST with GraphQL. And again, you could put GraphQL on top of REST or with REST and just basically start rolling off of using REST. But yeah, I don't think it'll replace it though. I mean, it's also fairly new, so yeah.
Yeah, but I believe that it will be more widespread use.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's on its way for sure.
And Rachel is asking, maybe I'm misunderstanding how this works, but wouldn't you still need backend queries to your database like SQL or NoSQL queries? And well, she posted two questions, in fact. Would an implementation with Postgre and GraphQL reduce the API complexity, but have the same database querying complexity?
So you wouldn't need to, no, because what GraphQL is going to do, you wouldn't need to make the same queries, basically, because you can, as I mentioned, you're basically pulling in the data from your database, and you can also push data to your database. I guess it depends on what you're writing and how you're managing your database, and if it already exists. Like in the instance, I'm using it more of like a headless kind of approach in the example I gave, but yeah, it depends on what you're already writing to your database. I know that's like a nested question. I get where you're coming from. It's a little confusing because you wouldn't necessarily have to. And then the second question would reduce the API complexity of the same database querying complexity. I guess it would reduce it does reduce the API complexity, but again, as I mentioned, it also depends on how you're setting up your GraphQL query types, and also on that page that I was showing in your Node server side, and how complex you start nesting. So yes, it puts a lot more of a load on the server end, but like again, if you can make it as complex or as simplistic as it can be, if that makes sense. And I know that seems like a kind of a cop-out answer, but like it really depends on what you're like, how you actually built it, and how like nested and what kind of data you're also pulling. Like, yeah. So it's all comes down to like architecture of what's in your database, and then also like how complex you end up pulling. So yeah.
Thanks. Well, there's a lot of questions for sure, and more coming in. Vema is asking, what is the security layer to prevent GraphQL injection attacks?
Yeah, that's actually a huge issue. I guess, well, not a huge issue. There is some, I don't know necessarily with like specific security with GraphQL, because of the instance of how I've used it is just using like a Node.js, and then like actually protection comes on the server side. And basically having it that way. For injection attacks, I feel like I'm really not too sure because it's something I haven't like aggressively looked into. But I imagine there's probably some workarounds and stuff like that. It's probably along the lines of it's either a loophole, like the caching is, where you have to do like 15 extra steps to get there, or it's something that someone's already figured out on the server side.
And Katie is asking, when you want to change your big project from REST API to GraphQL, what's the best method?
Yeah, so I think with that, like, what at CVS are doing this a little bit is like basically you want to have your REST API, and then kind of like I mentioned, add GraphQL either on top of it, or with it, and being able to also pull maybe even your REST APIs into your GraphQL server that way. So that would be one way to go around it. So you're still making that single endpoint call, but you're being able to also leverage your existing data that's being called in through your REST API and then rolling off of it by basically starting to replace some of those REST API calls with your GraphQL calls, if that kind of helps make sense. That's what I recommend. But
do you think like GraphQL, Nancy, is good for React or JavaScript developers, or if you come from a different background, can implement in a project GraphQL?
Oh yeah, yeah. So GraphQL is agnostic, so you don't have to have any sort of setup, and you don't have to have any architecture. You can do it with Angular too, or also if you don't know front end languages. I've also seen some people I was looking over have done it with Python, which is kind of wild. You can do quite a bit with it. Yeah, you don't have to be stuck into having to do it with just React or, yeah, or having a JavaScript node set up either. Yeah, there's also, like I mentioned, all those libraries and clients. There's so many different setups and stuff that you can do that they kind of all open source available to try out. So yeah.
Wow. So I guess that depending on with the pass of the time, with adoption growing, there will be more specialties like GraphQL for Python.
Yep.
That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Well, this has been an amazing session, Nancy. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your extensive knowledge with all of us. Thank you so much for everyone joining.